The date was late October, 1883. The place, the forested ridge country of northern Vermont, where the Green Mountains begin to press hard against the Canadian border, and the first killing frosts arrive before the leaves have finished falling. No one recorded her full name in any local ledger. Oral accounts from the region refer to her simply as Margaret, a widow recently arrived from the Connecticut River Valley, who had taken over a small parcel of land after her husband's passing earlier that spring. She was not a pioneer in the romantic sense. She was a woman trying to get through a winter alone. That October afternoon, she was gathering deadfall along the tree line when a lean, gray dog, untagged, unowned, moving with a quiet certainty, an animal that knew exactly where it was going, disappeared between two large white pines at the edge of the ridge. Something made her follow. Maybe it was the way the dog moved without hesitation. Maybe it was a stillness beyond the trees, a silence different from the usual silence of the forest. She pushed through the undergrowth for perhaps 40 yards before she stopped. What she found was not a ruin. It was a structure, low, moss-covered, half swallowed by decades of leaf fall and creeping vegetation, but intact. The walls were still standing. The roof, made of split cedar layered over birch bark, had sagged in one corner but had not collapsed. The door frame was sealed with packed earth and dry leaves, as if someone had closed it deliberately and walked away. From the outside, it looked like the forest had simply grown over a pile of old stones. But Margaret had spent enough time around her late husband's workshop to recognize intentional construction when she saw it. The stones were not piled. They were placed. She did not go inside that day. She stood at the threshold, looked at the low entrance, at the dark corridor leading inward, and made a decision she would not fully understand until the following spring. She would come back. If you've ever found something old that felt like it was built by someone who knew something you don't, stay with this video. Subscribe right now, because every week we bring you a real technique from frontier history that worked when life depended on it. Hit like, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and let's find out together what Margaret found inside that forgotten homestead. Margaret was 34 years old in the autumn of 1883. She had grown up in a farming household, knew how to preserve food, how to read weather, how to manage a kitchen fire. What she did not know, what no one had prepared her for, was how to heat a cabin alone through a Vermont winter with a single wood stove and a steadily shrinking wood pile. The cabin she had inherited was a standard single-room structure of the period, roughly 16 by 20 feet, about 4.9 by 6.1 meters, built with round-notched spruce logs, a central stone hearth, and a floor of rough-sawn pine planks laid directly over the ground. It was the kind of cabin that had been built quickly and practically by someone who expected to upgrade it within a few seasons and never did. The problems were not dramatic. They were relentless. The pine floor was the first thing she noticed. Even with a strong fire burning, the cold rose through the planks on the frozen ground below, settling around her ankles and crawling upward. A thermometer hung near the door read 28 degrees Fahrenheit minus 2 degrees Celsius on the floor level, while the stove surface glowed red at over 400 degrees Fahrenheit, 204 degrees Celsius. The heat was rising and escaping through the roof while her feet stayed frozen. She was burning energy that went straight to the sky. The second problem was the firewood itself. Her late husband had stacked a cord and a half of mixed hardwood against the cabin's south wall, but had been cut late and stored without cover. By mid-October, the outer layers were saturated with rain and sleet. Wetwood burns at a fraction of the heat of dry wood. It spends most of its combustion energy evaporating its own moisture before it can produce useful heat. She was burning more wood than she should have needed and getting less warmth in return. The chimney drew poorly in the mornings. Cold air sitting in the flue would push smoke back into the cabin when she tried to start the fire, filling the single room before the draft reversed and began pulling correctly. She had learned to open the door for a few minutes every morning to help the flue warm up, but opening the door in 15 degrees Fahrenheit minus 9 degrees Celsius air to heat the chimney felt like fighting a fire with water. She was not starving. She was not in danger of dying. But she was exhausted in a specific way that frontier women of that era knew well. The exhaustion of a system that demands constant attention and still barely functions. It was that exhaustion, not curiosity, not adventure, that made her go back to the forgotten homestead on the ridge. She returned 3 days later, on a gray November morning, carrying a lantern and a small iron pry bar she used for splitting kindling. The entrance corridor was a first surprise. It was not simply a doorway in a wall. It was a tunnel, roughly 6 feet long, about 1.8 meters, 3 feet wide, about 90 centimeters, built of stacked flat stones and roofed with heavy timbers covered in packed earth. To enter the cabin, you had to walk through this narrow passage, crouching slightly under the low ceiling, before reaching the actual door. It seemed awkward, inconvenient. Margaret almost dismissed it as a structural eccentricity, a builder who had simply placed the entrance wrong. But inside the passage, she noticed something. It was warmer, not dramatically warmer, but noticeably. The wind that had been cutting across the ridge outside was completely absent. The stone walls on both sides blocked lateral airflow entirely. The packed earth overhead insulated from above. She stood in that tunnel for a moment and understood, even without the vocabulary to explain it, that the passage was not an entrance. It was a trap, designed to stop cold air from rushing into the living space every time the door opened. The interior of the cabin confirmed the pattern. The floor was not wood. It was a layer of rammed earth, clay mixed with fine gravel, compacted to a smooth, hard surface roughly 4 inches, about 10 centimeters, thick, laid over a base of flat limestone slabs. This floor did not flex, did not rot, and did not transmit cold the way timber planks did. Limestone and compacted clay store heat differently than wood. They absorb warmth slowly during the day and release it slowly through the night, acting as a passive radiator after the fire dies down. The hearth was not at the center of the room. It was built into the north wall, the wall that faced the prevailing wind, and that wall was notably thicker than the others. Margaret pressed her palm against the stone. Even after years of abandonment and cold, the wall held a faint residual density, a sense of mass that the other walls did not have. Someone had built that wall with more stone than strictly necessary for structural reasons. They had built it thick, because thick stone holds heat. Against the east wall, she found a low wooden shelf with iron hooks above it, a drying rack positioned near, where the heat from the hearth would naturally travel before reaching the exterior wall. Firewood stored that would dry from the inside out, heated by the cabin's own warmth rather than the uncertain sun. She spent 2 hours inside that morning. She did not take notes. She had no notebook, but she walked back down the ridge with her lantern in one hand and a clear picture in her mind of what someone, whoever had built this place, had understood about the relationship between stone, air, and cold. To understand what Margaret had found, it helps to understand a concept that frontier builders knew by intuition long before it appeared in engineering textbooks: thermal mass. Every material around us absorbs heat and releases it at a different rate. Wood, for example, heats quickly and cools quickly. It responds fast to fire but loses its warmth just as fast when the fire dies. Stone, particularly dense sedimentary stone like limestone or sandstone, is the opposite. It absorbs heat slowly, sometimes taking hours to warm through completely, but once it has absorbed that energy, it holds it and releases it gradually, over many hours, long after the fire has gone cold. The builder of that homestead had used this principle deliberately, even if he never called it by name. The north wall, the wall that bore the brunt of winter wind, had been built to a thickness of roughly 24 to 28 inches, 60 to 70 centimeters, using flat-laid limestone. This was not standard construction. A typical frontier cabin wall of the 1840s or 1850s was built for structural support, not thermal storage, and rarely exceeded 8 to 12 inches, 20 to 30 centimeters, of effective stone mass. This wall was 2 to 3 times denser than the norm. It absorbed heat from the firebox on its interior face and radiated it back into the room over a period of 6 to 8 hours after the fire was banked for the night. The firebox itself was positioned low and deep, what builders today would recognize as a Rumford-style geometry, though likely arrived at independently. The firebox throat was narrow compared to base, which meant the fire burned hotter and more completely before gases escaped up the flue. Less unburned material meant less creosote, less smoke, and more radiant heat released into the room, rather than carried away by the draft. The clay floor worked in concert with the walls. Stone and clay together can store roughly 4 to 5 times more heat per cubic foot than timber and dirt fill. The floor absorbed heat during the active burning hours of the afternoon and early evening. then release it upward through the night, reducing the temperature drop that typically occurred between midnight and dawn, the hours when a sleeping person was most vulnerable to cold. The entry corridor addressed what builders called cold drop, the immediate loss of interior warmth each time a door opened to the outside. In a standard cabin door, opening for even 15 seconds in sub-zero temperatures could drop the interior air temperature by 4 degrees Fahrenheit to 6 degrees Fahrenheit, about 2 degrees Celsius to 3 degrees Celsius near floor level. The tunnel entrance acted as an airlock. The outer door was open and closed before the inner door was touched, so the living space was never directly exposed to exterior air. None of this required specialized tools or imported materials. The limestone was local. The clay was dug from the ridge itself. The timber for the entry corridor was split on site. What it required was knowledge, specific, deliberate knowledge about how heat moves, how stone behaves, and how cold enters a structure. Oral accounts from descendants of families who settled that ridge in the 1840s and 1850s suggest the homestead was built by a Finnish immigrant, a former farmhand from the Hame region of south-central Finland, where similar earth floor and thick wall construction had been common practice for generations. His name has not been preserved in any local registry. What he left behind was a building that outlasted everything around it. Margaret did not attempt to rebuild her cabin. She did not have the time, the resources, or the physical capacity to tear down walls and reconstruct a floor. What she did instead was something more practical and, in its own way, more interesting. She copied the ideas she understood, one at a time, using what she already had. The first modification was the entry corridor. She did not have enough stone to build a proper tunnel, so she constructed a 3-sided windbreak out of stacked spruce logs, 2 walls and a roof, roughly 5 feet long, about 1.5 meters, attached to the exterior face of her cabin door. It was crude compared to what she had seen on the ridge. The gaps between the logs were chinked with a mixture of wood ash, sawdust, and clay she dug from the creek bank 50 yards below the cabin. The roof was covered with a double layer of birch bark, weighted down with heavy stones. It looked, to any observer, like a partially built woodshed that had changed direction midway through construction, but the effect was immediate. The morning smoke back from her stove, that frustrating reversal draft that had been filling her cabin with smoke every cold morning, stopped on the 3rd day after she finished the windbreak. The entry passage had reduced the pressure differential between inside and outside air, stabilizing the draft and the flue before she even touched the stove damper. The second modification was the floor. She did not replace her pine planks entirely. Instead, she mixed a batch of clay slurry, thin enough to pour but thick enough to coat, from the same creek bank clay she had used for the windbreak, and she poured over the existing pine floor in a layer roughly half an inch, about 1.2 centimeters thick. She let it dry for 4 days, stirring the stove carefully to maintain a steady low heat, then applied a second coat of the same thickness. The clay cracked in a few places as it dried. Fine surface checks that she filled with a paste of ash and clay and smoothed with her palm. The carpentry was not elegant. The surface was uneven in places. But when she walked on it barefoot on the morning of November 14th, the thermometer outside reading 11 degrees Fahrenheit minus 12 degrees Celsius, the floor was warm, not hot, not dramatically different from the day before, but warm in a way that stone warms, steadily, evenly, without the sharp cold that had been rising to the pine planks every morning since October. The third modification took longer. She spent 3 evenings moving field stones from the creek bed up to the cabin, irregular pieces of granite and limestone ranging from 10 to 40 pounds, for 0.5 to 18 kilograms each, and stacking them against the interior face of the north wall, beside and behind the stove. She stacked them 2 to 3 feet high, 60 to 90 centimeters, leaving the stove's clearance intact and making sure no stone touched the metal directly. What she was building, without knowing the term, was a thermal battery, a mass of stone that would absorb heat radiating from the stove during the burning hours and release it slowly through the night. Each evening, carrying stones in her apron, she was quiet, deliberate. She was not trying to prove a theory. She was trying to stay warm. The community Margaret belonged to was loose by any standard, a scattering of farmsteads along the ridge road, connected by necessity rather than proximity. The nearest neighbor, a man who ran a small sawmill operation half a mile to the south, passed her cabin 2 or 3 times a week on his way to the road that connected the ridge to the valley town below. He noticed the windbreak first. "Looks like you're building a chicken coop on your front door," he told her one afternoon, pausing his horse on the road. His tone was not unkind. It was a tone of someone stating what everyone could plainly see. Margaret told him it kept the smoke from coming back in the morning. He nodded slowly in the way people nod when they are filing something away under the category of eccentric ideas that don't concern them. "Seems like a lot of work for a draft," he said, and moved on. The clay floor drew a different reaction. A woman from a farm 2 miles further along the ridge stopped by in early November to borrow a wedge iron and pause at the threshold, looking at the patchy, uneven clay surface that Margaret was still smoothing and finishing. "You covered your floor with mud," she said. It was an observation, not a question. "Clay," Margaret said. "It'll crack and powder, and you'll be breathing dust all winter." "It might," Margaret said. The most pointed comment came from the carpenter, who had helped build several of the newer cabins on the ridge that decade. He had a reputation for solid, reliable work and a firm opinion about what constituted proper construction. He came to look at the stone pile against the north wall. Someone had mentioned it at the feed store in the valley, apparently, and stood with his arms folded, studying the stack with the expression of a man performing a mental calculation he already knew the answer to. "All that weight against the wall will stress the base logs," he said, "and those stones will never get hot enough to do anything useful. You'd be better served with that wood in the stove than hauling rocks all night." He was not wrong about the stress. It was a legitimate concern that Margaret had partly addressed by keeping the stack away from the wall base. He was wrong about the stones. But no one knew that yet. The winter had not arrived. The cold came in the second week of November 1883 with the kind of deliberateness that old-timers described as the mountain closing its fist. It did not arrive as a single dramatic storm. It arrived as a sustained drop, a week of temperatures that fell each night and never fully recovered during the day, pressing the thermometer steadily lower until, by November 18th, the morning reading outside Margaret's cabin door was 4 degrees Fahrenheit minus 16 degrees Celsius. By November 22nd, it had not risen above 14 degrees Fahrenheit minus 10 degrees Celsius at midday for 4 consecutive days. On the ridge road, the effects were visible in small, specific ways. The sawmill operator's woodpile, a good, dry stack he had cut in early summer, was dropping faster than he had planned. Oral accounts from his family, recorded decades later, indicate he burned through nearly a quarter cord in those first 10 days of hard cold, against his estimate of roughly half that. His cabin, a newer single-room structure with a standard central hearth and timber floor, required a fire every 4 to 5 hours through the night to maintain a livable temperature. The woman whose farm sat 2 miles further along the ridge had a separate problem. Her woodpile was partially wet. A section of her stack had been exposed to a heavy October rain, without adequate cover, and the outer logs had not dried sufficiently before the hard freeze arrived. Wet wood at 20 degrees Fahrenheit minus 7 degrees Celsius behaves as a near-inert fuel. The combustion energy is almost entirely consumed evaporating the moisture trapped in the fiber before the wood itself can burn hot enough to produce radiant heat. She was feeding her stove nearly continuously and still waking the frost on the interior windowsills. At the carpenter's house in the valley, conditions were more comfortable. He had a well-built structure and a generous woodpile, but it also made, for years, the standard structural choices. Timber floor over a dirt crawl space, modest stone hearth, single-layer exterior walls of the period's typical thickness. His cabin held heat adequately while the fire was burning. In the hours between midnight and dawn, when a bank fire produces minimal output, the interior temperature dropped between 20 degrees Fahrenheit and 25 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius to 14 degrees Celsius, before morning. None of them thought about Margaret's cabin during those first hard weeks. Why would they? She was one woman with a modified woodshed door and a muddy floor. The idea that those rough modifications could matter, could actually produce a measurable difference in thermal performance, had not occurred to anyone on the ridge. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell. Because what happened when someone finally walked into that cabin and looked at the thermometer is the kind of number that doesn't leave you. It was a sawmill operator's wife who first noticed. She had stopped at Margaret's cabin on the morning of November 24th. Temperatures were sitting at 6 degrees Fahrenheit minus 14 degrees Celsius outside. To ask about a root cellar technique Margaret had mentioned in passing weeks earlier, she knocked, waited, and when Margaret opened the door, the woman stepped partway in without being invited, arrested by something she could not immediately name. It was warm, not the aggressive, face-reddening warmth of a roaring stove. The stove was not roaring. It was banked low, the damper half closed, a modest bed of coals barely visible through the door crack. The warmth was ambient, even the kind of warmth that comes from the walls and the floor rather than from a single source. The woman stood in the entry corridor for a moment, then stepped fully inside and stood without speaking. She had brought a small pocket thermometer, the kind sold in the Valley Town's general store, graduated in Fahrenheit, accurate to within about 2 degrees. She held it at waist height in the center of the room. It read 54 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 degrees Celsius. That morning, her own cabin, with a fire that had been burning steadily since 5 a.m., had read 36 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees Celsius at floor level before she left. The differential was 18 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius in Margaret's favor, with a fraction of the fire output. She asked to see the woodpile. Margaret's stack, a cord of mixed hardwood she had cut and covered properly, had diminished by roughly a third since October. The sawmill operator's pile, with a similar starting volume and a larger cabin to heat, had been reduced by nearly half. The carpenter's estimate, when word reached him later that week, was that his own household was burning approximately 40% more wood per week than Margaret's recorded consumption for the same period and roughly equivalent temperatures. The stone battery against the north wall was the primary differentiator, as best as anyone on the ridge could determine. By nightfall, after a full afternoon of fire, those stones, roughly 800 to 900 pounds, 360 to 410 kilograms, of mixed granite and limestone, had absorbed enough radiant heat to maintain the ambient room temperature above 45 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 degrees Celsius, for between 6 and 8 hours after the stove was fully banked. In a standard timber floor cabin of the same period, the temperature typically dropped to within 10 degrees Fahrenheit to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees Celsius to 8 degrees Celsius, of outside air within 4 hours of the fire dying down. The clay floor contributed a secondary but measurable effect. Its thermal mass, though shallower than the stone wall, stored heat at floor level and released it upward to the night, eliminating the ankle-height cold zone that had characterized Margaret's cabin in October. At 3 a.m. on the night of November 25th, with the stove cold and the outside temperature at 2 degrees Fahrenheit minus 17 degrees Celsius, the floor surface of Margaret's cabin measured 41 degrees Fahrenheit 5 degrees Celsius. The pine floor of the sawmill operator's cabin, measured the same night by his wife out of curiosity, read 26 degrees Fahrenheit minus 3 degrees Celsius, below freezing. These were not controlled laboratory conditions. They were practical observations made by practical people in the middle of a Vermont winter, but they were consistent, repeatable, and impossible to dismiss. The carpenter said nothing when he heard the numbers. He stood at the feed store in the valley, listening to the sawmill operator's account, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he asked a single question: how thick was the stone pile against the wall? That was November 1883. By the following autumn, 1884, 3 households on the ridge had added some form of stone thermal mass to their cabin interiors. None of them called it that. They called it doing what the widow did, or, in the case of one family further north on the road, simply the rock wall. Each household adapted the principle to their own materials and space. One family used a mix of river granite and old hearthstones salvaged from a collapsed outbuilding. Another stacked a lower, wider mass of flat slate along the interior base of their south-facing wall, reasoning that afternoon sun would help charge it through the window. A third built a proper rammed earth floor over 2 winters, section by section, as time permitted. The entry corridor took longer to spread. It required more labor, more material, and more willingness to alter the exterior appearance of a structure. But by the winter of 1885 to 1886, for cabins on the ridge had some form of enclosed entry vestibule, varying from a fully stone and timber tunnel to a simple board frame enclosure with a canvas inner door. Each reduced morning smoke back. Each reduced cold drop during entry. None of the builders, when asked, cited any formal source for the idea. They had seen it work. That was enough. The carpenter, for his part, made no public statement. But in the spring of 1885, a neighbor who helped with a barn repair noticed that the old single-layer north wall of the carpenter's own cabin had been rebuilt over the winter, thicker, with a double course of stone on the interior face that brought the effective wall mass to nearly 20 inches, 51 centimeters. The neighbor mentioned it. The carpenter said only that he had found some spare stone from a cleared field and hadn't wanted to waste it. Margaret herself did not become a figure of local authority. She was not consulted in any formal way, and there are no records of her writing down what she had done or why. What oral accounts suggest, pieced together from family recollections gathered in the 1920s by a local historical society, is that she simply continued to refine her own cabin over the following years, deepening the clay floor, adding a second ring of stones to the thermal stack, eventually replacing the birch bark roof of the entry corridor with a proper timber and earth cover. She lived in that cabin through at least 6 more winters. The gray dog, by the accounts of 2 neighbors who remembered it, spent the rest of those winters sleeping near the stone pile by the north wall. It was the warmest spot in the room. There is a particular kind of knowledge that does not travel well through institutions. It doesn't fit neatly into textbooks. It doesn't lend itself to patents or proclamations. It lives, instead, in the object it creates, in the thickness of a wall, in the hardness of a floor, in the specific angle of a firebox throat, in the length of a corridor that was built to stop the wind before the wind could reach the fire. The Finnish builder who constructed that homestead on the Vermont ridge, wherever he came from, whatever his name, carried knowledge that had been tested across generations of northern winters. He did not invent thermal mass. He did not invent the earth floor. These principles have been applied by builders across northern Europe, across Siberia, across the indigenous nations of the North American interior for centuries before his time. What he did was carry those principles with him across an ocean, read the specific conditions of Vermont ridgeline, and apply what he knew with precision and economy. He built a cabin that outlasted him by decades. He built a cabin that, abandoned and unmapped and half-buried in forest litter, was still standing and structurally coherent when a woman followed a stray dog to the trees in October of 1883. He built a cabin that, in a sense, taught a class to anyone willing to walk inside and pay attention. Margaret paid attention. She did not have an engineering degree. She did not have a library of building manuals. She had cold feet, a shrinking woodpile, and eyes that knew how to look a thing and understand what was doing. She copied what she saw, adapted what she couldn't replicate exactly, and let the results speak. The results spoke clearly. The knowledge encoded in that forgotten homestead was not primitive. It was not obsolete. It was by any functional standard superior to the standard construction practice of the surrounding community, and it proved that superiority under conditions that could not be argued with: sustained sub-zero temperatures, limited fuel, and the unforgiving arithmetic of heat loss against heat retained. This is what ancient building wisdom at its best actually is: not superstition, not sentiment, not nostalgia. It is engineering refined by necessity, tested by crisis, and transmitted through the one medium that never lies, the building that is still standing when others have fallen. The dog that led Margaret into the forest that October afternoon has no name in any record. Neither does the man who built the homestead it led her to. But the wall is still there, in the reconstructed accounts of those who walked into that room and felt the difference between a cabin that understood winter and one that merely endured it. What part of this, the stone thermal mass, the clay floor, the entry corridor, the thick north wall, would you actually consider applying to a structure today? And where are you watching from? What's the coldest winter you've ever lived through? Leave your answer below. Subscribe if you want to keep finding the techniques that worked when there was no margin for error. And like this video, because the builders who figured these things out deserve to be remembered